It was a warm evening in Florida, but the air was thick with tension, an unsettling prelude to what was about to unfold. Tevin Turner, a man who seemed to have everything, a loving girlfriend, a future full of promise, would soon be at the center of one of the most shocking and twisted cases the state had ever seen. But what led to that fateful night? Was it a simple argument gone too far, or was there something darker behind it all? On that night, a door slammed shut, and in the silence that followed, a life was torn apart. Her name was victim's name, a woman who had trusted the man she loved, who thought she knew him better than anyone else. But in that moment, all of it shattered. The questions began to surface almost immediately. Why? How? Was this a crime of passion, or was there something more to it? And then the truth began to surface, slowly, painfully, piece by piece. A trail of lies, secrets, and contradictions would lead investigators down a path they never expected. There was more to this story than anyone could have imagined. The police were left to piece together a puzzle, one with missing pieces, one that would stretch the limits of their investigation. And as for Tevin Turner, his story kept changing, twisting in ways that made even the most seasoned detectives question everything they thought they knew about him. This isn't just another case. This is a case that will keep you guessing until the very end. A case that will make you wonder, is anyone really who they say they are? Tonight, we dive into the chilling details of Tevin Turner's world, where lies blur the lines between truth and deception, and where the darkest secrets often remain hidden until it's too late. Stay with us as we unravel the shocking and heart-wrenching story of a murder that shook Florida to its core. Was it a crime of love gone wrong, or a cold, calculated act? Tevin Turner, charged with murder. But the question is, was it really him? Or did someone or something else pull the trigger that night? Her name was Christy Wesselman, a woman full of life, ambition, and dreams. To anyone who knew her, she seemed unstoppable, a light that drew people in with her kindness and infectious laughter. He had that rare quality that made everyone around her feel special, like they were the most important person in the world when she spoke to them. But there was more to her than just her charm. Beneath the surface, Christy was a woman with dreams of building a future, someone who believed in the idea of love, trust, and partnership. And yet, as bright as her future seemed, there was a shadow that had been growing in the background, a shadow she never saw coming. That shadow, it seemed, would eventually take everything from her. And just a few short hours before the unthinkable happened, she had no idea how close the danger was. Tevin Turner, her boyfriend, her partner in life. To the outside world, they appeared like any other couple, young in love and full of promise. They had plans, they had dreams, or so it seemed. But what if everything you thought you knew about someone was a lie? What if the person you trusted most, the one you thought would never hurt you, was hiding a side that no one could have imagined? The night of her death, it all came crashing down. What started as a simple disagreement, one that many couples face, soon spiraled into something far more dangerous. And in the blink of an eye, Christy was gone. The police would later arrive to a scene that left everyone reeling. A crime scene that seemed to raise more questions than answers. Was this a tragic accident? Was it something more calculated? As investigators began to piece together the events leading up to her death, they uncovered details that didn't add up, holes in the story, contradictions in the accounts. and enough confusion to leave even the most seasoned detectives questioning what had really happened. What drove Tevin Turner to allegedly take the life of the woman he loved? Was it a sudden outburst of rage, or was it a long simmering tension that finally exploded? And what of the moments leading up to the crime? Oh, what clues were left behind, hidden in plain sight, that could reveal the true nature of the relationship between the two? Did the signs of a troubled relationship lie buried beneath their facade of love? Or had something much darker been festering in the background, unnoticed by those closest to them? As the investigation unfolded, it would uncover shocking twists that no one could have anticipated, least of all the family and friends who were left in the wake of this devastating crime. The evidence seemed to point in one direction, but the more they learned, the more questions arose. Could Tevin Turner truly be capable of murder, or was there more to this than meets the eye? The answers are out there, but sometimes the truth is more complicated than we're ready to accept. And as we look deeper into the events surrounding Christy Wesselman's final moments, we will ask the question that no one has an answer to yet. Who exactly was the real victim here? Stay with us as we uncover the pieces of a story filled with love, betrayal, and the shocking revelation of what really happened that night. Christy Wesselman's life before it all changed was like any other young woman living in Florida, full of potential, full of promise. She had dreams. She wanted a family, a home, a life full of love and success. But what we see on the outside isn't always the full story. Behind the smiling photos, the laughter shared with friends, and the seemingly perfect Instagram posts, there were darker truths. Truths that no one could have predicted, especially not the people closest to her. Christy had met Tevin Turner through mutual friends, their connection instant and undeniable. It was one of those stories that felt like destiny. Two souls meeting by chance, but instantly connecting in a way that made you believe in love at first sight. At first, they were inseparable. They shared everything: their hopes, their fears, their favorite music, their passions. She spoke about him often to her friends and family, calling him the one who would change her life, who would help her build the future she'd always dreamed of. To her, Tevin was perfect. But as we dig deeper into their lives, we begin to see a different side of their relationship. A side that, in hindsight, was filled with cracks that no one could have seen until it was too late. Christy had always been a romantic at heart. She loved deeply and gave herself fully to those she cared about. But, like many women in their early 20s, she was still finding herself, still navigating what it meant to be independent while also being in a relationship. She had a passion for life, a passion for helping others, and an unwavering belief that she could conquer anything. But when it came to her relationship with Tevin, there were moments of doubt that she brushed aside, moments she dismissed because she didn't want to believe the truth. Tevin, on the other hand, seemed to fit the mold of the perfect boyfriend in the beginning. He was charming, good-looking, attentive, and thoughtful. But as time went on, Christy would start to notice small things that didn't sit right with her. Things that felt off, but were so subtle at first that she couldn't quite put her finger on them. In the early days, it was nothing major. Just the occasional mood swings that Tevin would have, the unexplained irritability, the odd silence that seemed to fall over him for no apparent reason. Christy would write these off as bad days, thinking nothing of them. She even joked with friends that everyone had their moments, their off days. But then came the jealousy. Tevin began to show signs of possessiveness that Christy hadn't noticed before. He'd become irritated when she spent too much time with friends, accusing her of neglecting him. It was subtle at first, something she could laugh off, but over time, those moments grew in frequency. She'd brush it aside, telling herself it was just part of being in a relationship. But deep down, a small part of her began to feel uncomfortable. And then there were the conversations, those rare but significant conversations that left her with more questions than answers. Christy and Tevin would often talk about their future, about the life they were going to build together. He spoke passionately about their dream home, their future kids, and a life of happiness. But sometimes he would say things that made her pause. He'd talk about owning a business together, one that would be successful, one that would help them escape the normal grind of life. But there was something in his tone, something in the way he spoke about this life that made Christy uneasy. It wasn't just the dream, it was the obsession with the dream, the sense that if things didn't go as planned, there would be consequences. Tevin's ambitions were grand, but they were also unrealistic. He spoke of wealth, fame, and fortune, an escape from the mundane. But as time went on, Christy began to see a darker side to these fantasies. She noticed that Tevin seemed obsessed with material things, with status, and with success. He began talking about getting rich quick, about making risky decisions that could change everything. And there were moments late at night when he'd rant about not wanting to wait anymore, about wanting to... As their relationship progressed, there were more signs of things being out of balance. Tevin began showing up late, disappearing for hours with no explanation, only to return with stories that didn't add up. Christy, confused but still hopeful, would question him. And he'd become defensive, even angry, shutting down any attempt to talk about his behavior. Hours passed before the discovery was made. By the time Christy's family began to grow concerned, it was already too late. Her mother, calling repeatedly with no answer, felt a tightening in her chest. Something wasn't right. Christy had never gone this long without responding. The calls grew frantic. Family members, friends, all began reaching out. When there was still no response, the worry turned to fear. Christy's best friend's name, was the first to take action, driving to Christy's apartment with a sinking feeling in her stomach. The closer she got, the worse her anxiety became. She arrived at the apartment complex and hurried up the stairs to Christy's door, her hand shaking as she knocked, the cold metal of the doorknob feeling like ice against her palm. There was no answer. Panic began to set in. Christy was always reachable, always responsive. So why now? Why tonight? With trembling hands, friend's name pulled out her phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher, calm but urgent, guided her through the process of entering the apartment. The door, thankfully, wasn't locked. And when friend's name stepped inside, she was hit with an overwhelming silence. The apartment was eerily still. Tevin was nowhere in sight. As she walked through the rooms, her heart pounding in her chest, she found Christy's phone on the table, its screen cracked. Then in the hallway, she saw it, the shape of a body, lying lifeless on the floor. The room seemed to fall away as the shock hit her like a wave. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled as she spoke into her phone. When the police arrived, it was a scene of chaos and confusion. They found Tevin in the apartment, sitting silently on the couch, his face a mask of numbness. His hands were shaking, and his eyes darted around the room as if he was unsure of where to look. There were no words. There was only the chilling silence of a man caught in the aftermath of what he had done. The first officer on the scene described Tevin as distant, almost detached, not reacting to the horror unfolding around him. The scene was a grisly one, and yet Tevin's expression remained unchanged, as though he were unable to comprehend the gravity of his own actions. Christy's family and friends, upon hearing the news, were devastated. They couldn't believe it, couldn't understand how the man they'd once welcomed into their lives could be capable of such violence. How could Tevin, the charming, good-looking guy they thought they knew, be responsible for such a brutal act? In the hours that followed, the truth began to settle in, piece by piece. The interviews with witnesses and friends revealed disturbing patterns. Tevin had shown signs of emotional instability in the days leading up to the crime, and though no one had expected it to escalate this far, there were whispers of jealousy, anger, and unresolved issues between the couple. The fact that Tevin had been the one to make the call to authorities, telling them what had happened, only deepened the mystery. Was he truly remorseful? Or was this just another part of the story he was telling? As the investigation continued, a picture of Tevin began to form. One of a man whose temper and passions had finally overtaken his better judgment. His actions, cold and calculated, had shattered more than just Christy's life. They had shattered a community that would never be the same. The questions swirled endlessly. Why did it happen? Was it truly a crime of passion or something darker? What could have been done to prevent it? And most haunting of all, could Christy have seen it coming? Stay with us as we follow this investigation and uncover the twist that no one could have expected. The morning after the crime, detectives flooded the scene, their faces grim as they began their investigation. This wasn't just another domestic violence case. It was something deeper, something more chilling. The cold body of Christy Wesselman lay in the hallway, her life stolen in a moment of brutal rage. And now it was up to the investigators to piece together what had happened. The first responders were quick, but the real work was just beginning. Detective Samantha Hayes was one of the first to take the lead on the case. She had seen her fair share of violence, but there was something about this crime that shook her to the core. Maybe it was the coldness of the scene or the fact that Tevin Turner, the prime suspect, hadn't shown any sign of remorse. He sat there like a man lost, staring blankly into space as they gathered the evidence around him. The silence in the apartment was deafening, every movement magnified in the chaos of what had transpired. As Detective Hayes walked through the apartment, she began to focus on the small details, the way the furniture was scattered as if a struggle had taken place, the overturned chair, the broken phone screen on the coffee table. But there was one thing that stuck out to her: the absence of blood. In most cases of violent crime, blood would be the first thing you'd notice. Yet here the scene was almost eerily clean. The only trace of violence was Christy's body, but even that seemed almost too controlled. The crime scene wasn't just a puzzle, it was a carefully constructed one, as though someone had deliberately tried to remove the chaos of their actions. The police weren't sure yet, but they had a gut feeling that this wasn't going to be a straightforward case. Detective Hayes had worked with her partner, Detective John Miller, for years. and they both knew how to spot a lie. Tevin Turner's statement came in as expected. He said it was an accident, a fight that got out of hand. He claimed they'd been arguing, just like any other couple. He said that Christy had been the one to provoke him and that in a moment of fury, he had struck her, knocking her unconscious. But that was where the inconsistencies began to surface. First, there was the time. Tevin said he had found Christy unconscious on the floor, but there was no sign of struggle where he claimed she fell. There were also no marks on his hands, no visible wounds that would suggest he'd been in a physical altercation. And when the officers examined the scene, there was no indication that he had tried to administer any kind of first aid. No signs of panic, no sign of remorse. His version of events didn't add up, but perhaps the most damning piece of evidence came from the forensics team. They'd found traces of Christy's blood on Tevin's clothes, but there was something more unsettling. The blood on his shirt was too clean, too organized, as though it had been placed there deliberately. This wasn't just a case of someone losing control. It was something more methodical. The question was, what had truly happened that night? As the investigation progressed, more and more witness statements began to trickle in. Friends and family of Christy all spoke about the same thing: the growing tension between the couples. They all described Tevin as someone who had a temper, someone who could be charming one moment and explosive the next. No one, however, had ever seen this side of him. They didn't know the extent of his jealousy, the deep insecurity that he harbored. Christy had never spoken openly about the details of her relationship, but looking back, those closest to her now saw the warning signs, the controlling behavior, the constant need to be reassured, the way Tevin would lash out if things didn't go his way. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a crime of passion. It wasn't a simple argument gone wrong. This was something much darker, a planned act of violence executed with chilling precision. The breakthrough came when a neighbor came forward. He had heard the argument between Christy and Tevin that night. He described how the yelling had gone on for hours, how it escalated until the only thing that could be heard was the sound of Tevin shouting, loud and forceful, like a man trying to overpower something much more than a disagreement. He recalled hearing something crash in the apartment, followed by a muffled scream. But what truly caught the detective's attention was the fact that the neighbor had seen Tevin leave the apartment shortly after the sound of the crash. Tevin, with his hands in his pockets, leaving the scene without a hint of urgency. No sign of a man who had just injured the woman he supposedly loved. The neighbor's testimony was crucial. It shattered Tevin's defense. If he had left the apartment after the incident, then his version of events was a lie. But even more chilling was what Detective Hayes uncovered next. A search of Tevin's personal belongings revealed a collection of notebooks, journals where he'd written about his fantasies, his desires for wealth, for power, for control. It seemed innocent enough at first. A dream of success, a hope for the future. But there was a pattern, a dark undertone to everything he had written. Tevin had been planning something. It wasn't clear yet if he had planned Christy's death, but there was no doubt that he had been fantasizing about it, even if only subconsciously. He had written about eliminating obstacles, about breaking free from the constraints of a life he found limiting. And when Christy refused to follow his vision, when she became the obstacle, It was almost as if he had no choice in his mind but to act. The tension in the investigation continued to mount. Every new revelation brought more questions, and with each piece of evidence, Tevin's version of events seemed less and less believable. He had claimed that it was an accident, that he had never meant to hurt her. But his actions, his behavior after the fact, painted a different story entirely. His lack of remorse, the calmness in his demeanor, the evidence of premeditation, it all pointed towards something far more calculated than a moment of passion. As the case reached its boiling point, Detective Hayes knew they were getting closer to the truth. The evidence, the statements, the inconsistencies, everything was coming together. But there was still one question left hanging in the air. Was Tevin Turner the cold-blooded killer the evidence suggested? Or was there something even darker lurking beneath the surface? The investigation was far from over, but one thing was certain. The closer they got to the truth, the more questions arose, and each new development was more shocking than the last. With the case hanging in the balance, the real story had only just begun to unravel. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the twists and turns of this harrowing investigation and reveal the dark secrets that Tevin Turner tried to bury. The investigation had reached its critical juncture. Detective Samantha Hayes had spent months digging into every aspect of Tevin Turner's life, pulling at threads that led her down a dark and twisted path. What seemed like a straightforward crime, a lover's quarrel turned violent, was now anything but. The truth was more complicated than anyone had initially realized. And now everything was about to come to light in a way no one expected. It was an early morning in the courthouse when the breakthrough came, when everything they thought they knew about the case was turned upside down. Detective Hayes sat in the courtroom, her eyes fixed on Tevin Turner. His face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze, a hint of fear, a flash of regret. It was the first time she'd seen that expression on him, the first time he'd seemed truly aware of the gravity of the situation he was in. The day had begun like any other, with the defense and prosecution presenting their cases. The prosecution had laid out their argument. Tevin was guilty of premeditated murder, a man who'd meticulously planned the death of his girlfriend, Christy Wesselman. The defense had tried to paint it as a tragic accident, a heat-of-the-moment decision that spiraled out of control. But all of that changed when the defense presented a piece of new evidence, something that no one had seen coming. The defense had been sitting on this evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it. And as the courtroom sat in tense silence, it hit like a thunderclap. They produced a recording from a surveillance camera in the parking lot of Tevin's apartment complex. The timestamp was crucial because it showed Tevin leaving the apartment the night of the murder. But what made this evidence so shocking wasn't just the fact, it was what happened after. In the footage, Tevin is seen walking away from the apartment complex, but as he approaches his car, he pauses. The camera zoomed in just enough to reveal the slight, almost imperceptible motion of him looking over his shoulder. And then, in the eerie silence that followed, something strange happens. Tevin's hand reaches into his pocket. He pulls out something, a small metallic object, and, for the briefest moment, the camera catches a flash of light. It's a knife, a glint of steel in the dark. The defense's argument was clear. Tevin had been in a state of panic after the altercation. He wasn't planning murder. He had grabbed the knife in a fit of fear, thinking it would protect him. But in the end, that moment of panic had turned deadly. The defense's strategy was simple. Humanize Tevin. Show him as a man who was afraid, someone who wasn't capable of consciously taking another life. But the prosecution wasn't ready to concede, and neither was Detective Hayes. As the defense rested, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. That video, the one that had seemed like a lifeline for Tevin, was now their greatest weapon. The camera footage was damning, but not because of what it showed, it was what it didn't show. Detective Hayes knew something the jury didn't. That knife had been planted. She had gone over the footage multiple times, and in the split second that the knife was revealed, there was something that caught her attention, something that Tevin had missed. The reflection in the glass of his car showed a glimpse of someone else, a figure standing in the shadows, just out of frame, watching him. Someone had been there, someone who had never been mentioned in the entire case. The question was, who? Who? You! In the days following the revelation, the investigation took a drastic turn. Detective Hayes followed up on this new lead, digging into Tevin's past, his associates, anyone who could have been involved. It wasn't long before she uncovered a startling connection. Tevin had been seeing someone else, a woman who, unbeknownst to Christy, had been in the picture for months. Her name was Amanda Simmons, and her involvement was the missing piece to the puzzle. Amanda had been a constant presence in Tevin's life, a friend who had grown into something more. The relationship had been a secret, one Tevin had kept hidden from Christy despite his claims of loyalty. As Detective Hayes dug deeper, she discovered that Amanda had been in the apartment complex that night, and according to several eyewitness accounts, she had been seen leaving Tevin's apartment just before the argument turned violent. The revelation about Amanda Simmons wasn't just a shock. It was the key to understanding what happened that night. Tevin's story began to fall apart. The defense's narrative of a terrified man trying to protect himself became less convincing when the picture of his secret relationship with Amanda came to light. Could it be that Christy's murder wasn't a crime of passion after all? Was it possible that Tevin had been manipulating the situation from the beginning, hiding the truth behind a mask of grief and confusion? The tension was unbearable as the trial neared its final stages. The jury was left to deliberate, and for the first time in the entire case, the audience could feel the uncertainty hanging in the air. Would Tevin Turner be convicted of murder? Or would the defense succeed in convincing the jury that his actions had been driven by fear and a momentary lapse in judgment? The clock was ticking, and the world watched as justice hung in the balance. Then came the final day of the trial. The jury, after hours of deliberation, returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the decision aloud. Tevin Turner, guilty of second-degree murder. The air in the room was thick with disbelief. Tevin's face was a mask of emotion, shock, anger, and perhaps a touch of relief, as though he had been waiting for this moment, preparing himself for the inevitable. For Christy's family, it was a bittersweet victory. They had fought for justice, and they had finally gotten it. But in the aftermath, they knew that nothing would ever truly bring Christy back. The truth had been uncovered, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. But the damage had already been done. The murder of Christy Wesselman had not only destroyed her life, it had shattered the lives of everyone who had loved her. And as the courtroom emptied, one thing was clear. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than we're ready to accept. Justice had been served, but the real cost of the crime was something that could never be fully measured. Tevin Turner would spend years in prison, but the questions, those lingering questions, would remain. Had he truly acted alone? Or had there been someone else pulling the strings from the shadows? As the final gavel fell, the truth had been revealed, but the story was far from over. Stay with us as we continue to explore the aftermath of this tragic case and the mysteries that still linger in the shadows. The courtroom was still when the final verdict was read aloud. Tevin Turner, his face drawn and pale, stood motionless, his eyes locked on the floor as the judge's voice echoed through the room. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tevin Turner, guilty of second-degree murder. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. For Christy Wesselman's family, those words were both a triumph and a tragedy. A victory for justice, yes, but at what cost? Christy was gone. The life she had fought so hard to build, love she had invested in, all shattered in a single violent moment. Her family sat in silence, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. They had gotten justice, but they had lost so much more. Tevin's expression remained unreadable as the sentencing hearing proceeded. He had been found guilty, but the legal battle wasn't over. There would be appeals, motions, delays. Tevin would likely spend decades behind bars, but even that couldn't erase the enormity of what he had done. For Christy's family, the verdict was a small comfort in a world that would never be the same again. The room fell silent as the judge called for the sentencing. Tevin Turner was sentenced to 25 years to life, a sentence that felt both fitting and inadequate. Christy's mother, sitting in the front row, wiped tears from her eyes, her face a mask of sorrow and resignation. She had fought so hard for her daughter, for the truth, and while the legal system had done its part, it didn't change the fact that Christy was gone forever. Moon. As Tevin was led away, the emotions in the room were palpable. Justice had been served, but the pain remained. For Christy's family and friends, the healing would be long, and it would never be complete. They would always carry the weight of her loss. For them, this trial wasn't just about proving guilt. It was about finding closure, though they knew deep down that no verdict could ever truly provide that. In the months that followed, the family of Christy Wesselman tried to rebuild their lives. Her mother, in particular, struggled to find meaning in the aftermath. She channeled her grief into advocacy, speaking out about the signs of domestic violence, raising awareness about the dangers of toxic relationships. Christy's legacy, in a way, had become something larger than herself, a symbol of resilience and the fight for justice. Her friends, too, found themselves grappling with the loss. They had never imagined that the man who seemed to care for her, the man they'd welcomed into their lives, could have been capable of such violence. The shock waves reverberated through their community, and for many, it was a wake-up call. A reminder that sometimes the person you trust the most can be the one who betrays you the most. Tevin's conviction also had lasting effects on the criminal justice system. His case prompted further discussions on the importance of investigating the psychological profiles of suspects, the role of manipulation in abusive relationships, and how often the signs of violence are overlooked in seemingly normal relationships. His trial became an example, a cautionary tale for both law enforcement and the public at large. But for those who loved Christy, the aftermath was bittersweet. They had no way of bringing her back, no way to reverse the events that had led to that fateful night. But they had found some semblance of peace. They had honored her memory by ensuring that her story would be told, not just as a tragic tale of love gone wrong, but as a testament to the strength and courage it took to stand up for what was right, even in the face of the unthinkable. As the final chapter of this case was written, the question remained, was justice truly served? Could anyone who had lived through this nightmare ever truly heal? And what about the silent victims, the ones still trapped in toxic, abusive relationships, unable to find a way out? These are the questions that linger, the ones that don't have easy answers. The case of Tevin Turner and Christy Wesselman is one that will stay with us long after the verdict has been handed down, long after the courtroom lights have dimmed. It is a reminder that the fight for justice is never easy and that the consequences of violence ripple far beyond the courtroom. And so, we end this chapter, but the questions remain. Is anyone ever truly who they seem to be? And how well do we really know the people we love? If you've learned something from Christy's story, if you felt the impact of this tragedy, then don't let her story fade into the background. Share it. Talk about it. And if you're watching this and you've ever felt trapped or unsafe in a relationship, reach out. Reach out. There are people who care, people who want to help. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that uncover the truth and bring justice to the light, subscribe now. Don't miss out on the next chapter in this journey. Hit the bell icon to stay informed and become part of our community. Let's keep the conversation going, because together we can make sure the truth never fades away. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and always remember, sometimes the hardest part of the truth is simply facing it. Until next time.